They left me at a rest stop. No phone, no money, just the sound of the car engine fading into the Colorado mountains. I was 22, and that was the moment I stopped being a son and started becoming someone else. This isn't a story about going back. It's about what happens when you don't. About rebuilding from zero, finding strangers who become family, and confronting the ones who thought you'd never rise. You want revenge? Sometimes it's quieter than you think. Stick around, you're not going to see it coming. Ely Mercer lived in the basement of his family's house in Fairview, Missouri, a cluttered space with dim lighting and a damp chill that never seemed to go away. Most nights, he kept his head down and his mouth shut. That morning had been no different. As he came upstairs, his father, Rick, Sr., was already in one of his moods. "You're just dead weight," he snapped, waving a coffee mug like a weapon. Ely said nothing. Nancy, his mother, was at the sink washing dishes, eyes locked on the running water. She flinched when Rick pushed Eli aside, muttering, "Rick, that's enough." But the sentence trailed off, just like always. They were headed to Colorado for Uncle Rick Jr.'s wedding. An unusual event for a family that hadn't taken a vacation in over a decade. Eli hadn't been asked if he wanted to go, he'd just been told to pack a bag. The family's aging Suburban roared down the interstate, a mix of old fast food wrappers and tension filling the air. Tyler, Eli's younger brother and their father's golden child, cranked up rap music in the back seat. Rick Sr. barked directions and insults, chastising Eli for misreading GPS instructions. Nancy, ever detached, touched up her lipstick in the visor mirror. Somewhere in the middle of Colorado, surrounded by pines and mountains, they pulled into Dry Creek Rest Stop. A tiny slice of nowhere with a faded sign, a grimy restroom, and 2 vending machines humming under the harsh sun. Eli, cramped and aching, asked to use the bathroom. He left his phone charging in the car. He didn't take his wallet. Why would he? He was just stepping out for a minute. 10 minutes later, he emerged into a painfully bright sky. The parking space where the Suburban had been was empty. He blinked. Laughed once. Maybe they'd moved the car for laughs. He walked the lot. Circled twice. Nothing. He called their names. No answer. A man buying chips from the vending machine gave him a strange look. Time passed. An hour, then 2. Each moment stretched longer, darker. At first, Eli told himself they'd return, eventually, that it was just another sick joke. But as the sky began to blush with sunset, the truth settled like ice in his gut. He sat alone on the curb, his knees pulled to his chest, watching cars come and go. None of them were his, and as the camera of this life panned slowly back, Ellie became smaller, swallowed by wilderness, silence, and the unshakable realization that his family had truly, deliberately left him behind. Eli stayed at that rest stop for hours. At first, he waited with a strange kind of hope, the kind that fools you into thinking maybe things aren't as bad as they look. But hope is a fickle thing. It slips through your fingers when reality shows its face. By late afternoon, that hope had turned to a tight ache in his chest. Still, he stayed, until a dusty minivan pulled in and a woman stepped out with 2 young kids. She noticed him right away, tired, dusty, alone. "You okay?" she asked gently. Eli stood, managing a polite smile. "Family emergency," he said. "They had to leave, but someone's coming. Any chance you're headed into town?" There was hesitation, a long glance between her and her kids, but something about Eli, the way he stood, the crack in his voice, made her nod. On the ride, Eli stared out the window while the kids bickered in the back seat. His mind drifted. He thought about all the little humiliations. The way Tyler had once told his girlfriend Eli was off. The time Rick Sr. ripped up his college acceptance letter. How Nancy had never said more than "leave him alone" in a voice barely above a whisper. And now this, left on the side of the road like trash. They dropped him at the edge of Grand Junction. He found a public phone, called the shelter listed on a crumpled flyer he'd seen on the bulletin board. A man named Dave answered, told him to wait. An hour later, Eli was stepping through the doors of the community center, greeted by the stale scent of soup and detergent. They gave him a cot, a used toothbrush, a hot meal. He ate in silence, the noise of others around him muffled, like he was underwater. The next morning, Dave sat with him, calm and direct. Told him how to request a replacement ID, how to apply for emergency food vouchers, how to move forward. Later, alone in the tiny computer room, Ely opened a browser. He searched for Rick Jr.'s wedding details, found the location, the guest list. He could still go. He could still confront them, but his hand hovered over the mouse and something in him pulled away. Why run after people who had never looked back? He shut it all down. As he walked out of the shelter, the wind tugged at a flyer taped to the window. Help wanted, dishwasher, Sonny's Diner. He paused, stared at the reflection of himself in the glass. Bruised, thin, but still standing. A whisper rose from somewhere deep inside. So this is where it begins. The kitchen at Sonny's Diner was hotter than hell and twice as loud. When Ely asked for work, the woman behind the counter, grey hair streaked with purple, arms folded, gave him a once-over, like she'd seen 100 kids like him before. Maybe she had. The dishwasher quit yesterday, she said flatly. If you steal, I'll bury you behind the walk-in. Start now. Her name was Geraldine Blackstone, and she ran Sonny's with the iron will of a woman who'd survived more than a few battles. Ely nodded and rolled up his sleeves. He started at the sink, soap suds and scalding water, fry oil in the air. Cooks shouting out orders. Ely barely looked up. Hours passed like minutes. He didn't stop until the last dish was stacked. During his second shift, he met Doug Hartley, a regular customer with a scruffy beard and a voice like gravel. You knew? Doug asked, dipping toast in his coffee. Ely nodded. You homeless? Doug asked again, more direct. Ely didn't answer, but Doug just nodded back like he understood. Later that week, Doug returned with a folded city map and marked all the best places for free meals, secondhand clothes, even where the bus drivers wouldn't check fare. Ely started putting things together, piece by piece. Shelter at night, diner by day, a beat-up studio apartment above a laundromat. First paycheck in his hand like it was gold. He bought a cheap prepaid phone, activated it in the corner of a Walmart parking lot. And then, against his better judgment, he made a call. Nancy answered. Her voice was shaky. Ellie? Oh, thank God, we thought something happened. It was supposed to be a joke, you know, just a prank. We waited for you, really. In the background, Rick Sr.'s voice barked. Stop being dramatic. Just come home. Then Tyler chimed in, chuckling. You're alive? Man, I had money on you crying in a ditch. Ely stared out the window of his tiny apartment. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't cry, just said, quiet and certain, and watch me live. He ended the call, tossed the phone onto the couch. Outside, the sun hit the rooftop across the street, and for the first time in his life, Ely didn't feel small. She came in every Tuesday and Thursday, always alone, always focused. Kendra Mills, a med student, judging by the stack of textbooks and flashcards she spread across the counter at Sonny's. Her order never changed. Denver omelette, no tomatoes, extra coffee. Ely noticed she had this odd habit of zoning out mid-bite, fork suspended halfway to her mouth, lost in thought, like time had frozen around her. It started small. One afternoon she looked up mid-study, eyes scanning his chest. Your name tag's wrong, she said. You're not a Salvador. He blinked. I'm not? She grinned. Definitely more of a Elwood. From then on, it became their thing. Every visit, she'd rename him. He'd play along, deadpan. My parents were indecisive. The flirtation was so low-key it barely qualified, but it was the most natural thing Ely had felt in a long time. One night, her study group cancelled last minute. She lingered at the counter, scrolling her phone, then looked up. I've got a reservation for 2 at Antonio's and no one to go with. Ely wiped down the counter a little too long, then said, I know a guy. The pizza joint was cozy, candlelit, humming with soft jazz. They didn't talk about med school or omelettes. Instead, Kendra told him about working nights at the clinic to afford tuition. Lee, in turn, opened up just a little. Said his family used to live nearby, didn't say why they didn't anymore. It was the start of something real, though neither of them named it yet. Weeks passed, and Kendra started showing up with leftovers, coffee she brewed herself, and one morning a small indoor plant for Eli's windowsill. One night, after her shift and his, she brought over a bag of groceries and cooked pasta in his tiny kitchen. The noodles clumped, the sauce burned a little, but they sat on the floor of his apartment anyway, laughing, eating off paper plates. No candlelight, no music, just the hum of the fridge, the faint sound of traffic outside, and the quiet comfort of two people learning to share space. It was the first time Eli ate a cold dinner and felt full in more ways than one. Eli started taking online courses at night, business management, some entry-level accounting. It wasn't glamorous, but it made sense. In the early hours, between shifts and study sessions, he sat at the corner booth in Sonny's, textbooks open, earbuds in, trying to relearn the idea of a future. One night after closing, Geraldine wiped her hands on her apron, leaned against the counter and said, "I'm thinking of opening a second location, other side of town, Sonny's East. You want to run it?" Eli stared at her, stunned. "Me?" She didn't blink. "You already do half the damn job," he told Kendra that night. She was half asleep, curled beside him on the couch, her head on his shoulder. "You should do it," she mumbled. "You can do it." So they did. Moved into a small rental house with 2 bedrooms and sunlight in the mornings. The kind of place where things didn't echo. They got married in the park down the street. Doug showed up in a wrinkled button-up and sneakers. Geraldine baked the cake. It was awkward and imperfect and completely theirs. Ellie came first, a daughter with Kendra's eyes and Eli's quiet. Max followed 2 years later, a wild thing in a Spider-Man costume and untied shoes. The house was never silent, never spotless, but always full. Eli taught Ellie how to set the table. Forks on the wrong side, every time. Kendra would smile and fix it behind her. And through it all, Geraldine kept showing up. One evening, she bit into a slice of apple pie Eli had baked, his own twist on her original recipe. She chewed, swallowed, then said, "You've got the hands for pastry." Eli turned away before they saw his face. But his shoulders shook, just once, not from grief this time, but gratitude. It was past midnight. The kids were asleep, Kendra breathing slow beside him. Eli lay awake, staring at the glow of his phone, the old email account, the ghost of another life. He hadn't checked it in months, but tonight, something pulled him back. The first thing he saw was a news article. Tyler Mercer, 31, arrested for DUI, no injuries. The mugshot showed a bloated version of his high school self, still smug, just cracked. He scrolled deeper. Nancy's Facebook was filled with throwback photos. Him, Tyler, a Christmas tree, smiles that never meant much. The captions were syrupy, "Missing my boys every day." On Rick Sr.'s page, it was bitterness. Posts about the hardware store going under, rants about corporate greed. Not once did they mention Eli. Like he'd been erased. The ache was dull, not sharp, like pressing a bruise that had already faded. He shut the phone and leaned back. The next morning, Geraldine tossed him a ring of keys. "She's yours now, Sonny's East, I'm retiring, sort of." Eli stared at them like they might burn him. Later that week, Kendra came home to find a printed receipt on the kitchen table. Payment confirmation. A chunk of her medical school debt, gone. She read it 3 times before saying anything. When she finally looked up, her mascara was already running. "Why?" she asked. Edie shrugged. "Because you believed in me before I did." That night, he pulled up an old photo of Rick and Nancy on their wedding day. They looked so young, so sure. He stared at it a while, then deleted the email account. Deleted the ghost. Shut the door for good. Outside, the restaurant lights buzzed softly. His name was on the lease now. His children were asleep upstairs. And in the silence of his office, Eli clenched his hand once, just to feel that he still could. The back office at Sonny's East smelled like coffee grounds and fryer oil. Eli was bent over a clipboard, double-checking supply numbers, when Maya poked her head in. "There's a family out front asking for you," she said, cautious, like she already knew something wasn't right. When Eli stepped through the swinging door, time didn't just slow, it cracked. Rick Sr. was thinner than Eli remembered, shoulders slumped in his old leather jacket, his once imposing frame now almost frail. Nancy stood beside him in a floral blouse and too much makeup, her smile brittle, eyes darting. Tyler leaned against the counter, heavier, sweat beading at his collar with a forced grin. A younger woman, quiet and unsure, lingered behind them. Ember, Eli figured she must be Tyler's new wife. There was a pause. Rick Sr. spoke first, voice rough. "It's been a long time, son." Nancy chimed in quickly. "We've been looking for you. It was all just a big misunderstanding, you know?" Tyler snorted. "Families fight, but they fix it, right?" Eli didn't blink. "Why now?" They glanced at one another. The facade slipped. Rick admitted his heart wasn't doing well, no insurance, no savings. Nancy needed surgery on both knees. Tyler had blown through jobs, racked up 3 DUIs, and now they were living on borrowed time and borrowed money. And they'd seen the article, Sonny's East, a successful small business in Grand Junction, Eli's name in bold. They weren't there for closure, they were there for a bailout. Eli didn't flinch, he just nodded. "Come to my house for dinner tonight?" They brightened immediately, grateful, oblivious. Tyler clapped him on the shoulder like they were best friends again. But as they left, Eli caught a glimpse of Kendra standing behind the pass window, wiping a dish she'd already cleaned twice. Her eyes didn't blink, cold, knowing. The house smelled like enchiladas and lemon cleaner. Ellie carefully laid out the silverware. Forks all on the wrong side. Max wore his Spider-Man costume because it was Tuesday. Kendra leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Are you sure about this?" Eli nodded once. "I need to see them, one last time." The knock came at 6 sharp. The family stepped in like guests, as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Nancy gasped when she saw the kids, crying softly. Rick Sr. called Kendra Karen twice. Tyler made awkward jokes, dropping phrases like, "Family's gotta help family," over salad. Kendra took Ellie and Max upstairs for bath time. Eli stayed. The moment stretched, quiet and hot. He leaned forward, his voice calm. "Do you remember telling me I wasn't allowed to apply to college?" He turned to Nancy. "Do you remember what you did when he threw out my application?" Her silence said everything. He turned to Tyler. "And you? Telling my girlfriend I was broken. You remember that?" They shifted in their chairs, faces tight. Then Eli pulled a check from his pocket. $73.50. He placed it on the table. That's what it would have cost for a Greyhound ticket from Grand Junction to Fairview. The price to come home, if I'd wanted to. Rick Sr. exploded. "Ungrateful little... After all we gave you, this is what you do?" Ellie stood. His voice was steady. "I've been home for a long time. This is it. You're looking at it." He opened the front door without another word. As they shuffled out, Rick's face twisted, fury behind his eyes. But Eli didn't flinch. Not this time. The security camera footage played back in grayscale. Rick stood on the porch, glaring at the check Eli had handed him, then tossed it on the doorstep like trash. Nancy sobbed against the car door. Tyler stood back, arms crossed, staring at the house with something darker than anger. Envy. Eli watched the screen alone for a while, then stumbled to the bathroom, closed the door, and sank to the floor. The panic came hard, tight chest, shallow breaths, a ringing in his ears. 15 years of distance could stop the old storm from rolling in. Kendra found him like that, knees to chest, hands trembling. She didn't speak. Just sat beside him and rested her hand on his shoulder. "They can't take anything from you unless you give it to them," she whispered. The words stuck, anchored him. The next morning, Eli called a lawyer. He set up restrictions, blocked their names from accessing anything legal or financial, had the restaurant staff briefed on what to do if anyone asked about him. He even changed a few of his personal privacy settings just in case. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. Later that week, he returned to the kitchen at Sonny's East. His apron was stiff, his hands steady. Through the serving window, he watched the lunch crowd flow in. People coming in for meatloaf, pie, coffee refills. Life. His life. Outside, the world spun on. Inside, Ely Mercer was still standing, and this time, no one could touch what he'd built. 5 years had passed, but some ghosts still knew how to find their way to the surface. One evening, while Eli sat with a cup of lukewarm coffee, scrolling absent-mindedly through local news, a headline stopped him cold. In Memoriam, Nancy Mercer. The photo was a few decades old, hair perfectly curled, pearl earrings, that soft, polite smile. The obituary was short, vague, wrapped in pleasantries. No cause of death, no mention of her eldest son. Eli didn't hesitate. He ordered a sympathy bouquet online, simple, white lilies, no card, no return address, and he didn't go to the funeral. Life, by then, had carved a rhythm of its own. Ellie, now 7, practiced pirouettes on the lawn, spinning like her feet were made of light. Max, in his signature Tuesday Spider-Man outfit, ran laps around the flower beds. Kendra sat at the patio table with a calculator and 2 mugs of coffee, frowning at the household spreadsheet Ellie had half filled, wrong columns, decimals misplaced. "You mixed the grocery budget with the electric again," she said, laughing as she shook her head. Then the next ripple arrived. A small regional magazine published a feature called From Rock Bottom to Community Pillar. Eli's face was there, smiling modestly in front of Sunny's East. The article praised his rise, the restaurant's charm, his commitment to second chances. Somewhere, a copy made its way into the hands of an old friend of Nancy's, who forwarded it to Rick Sr. with the subject line, "Is this your son?" A week later, they showed up. Rick, Tyler, even Amber, standing awkwardly behind them. They knocked, once, then twice, no shouting, no speeches, just the sound of hope scraping against a locked door. Inside, Eli stood in the hallway. He heard everything, but he didn't move. Eventually, the footsteps faded. Outside, the world continued. Ellie was trying to teach Max how to spin. Kendra watched from the porch, arms crossed, smiling at the chaos. Ellie stepped into the yard, crouched down, ruffled Max's hair. "Did you ever go back to your old house?" Ellie asked out of nowhere. Eli glanced at the sky, then smiled. "I never went back," he said. "I just kept going forward." As the evening light softened, the camera pulled back over their small home, over the laughter, the garden hose still dripping on the walkway, until it landed on the weathered sign above the restaurant across the street. Sunny's East since 2012? Fade to black. Sometimes the people who break you are the ones who taught you how to rebuild. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't rage or confrontation, it's peace. It's a quiet life built on your own terms, far from the noise, far from the past. We all carry scars, but they don't have to define us. What matters is what we grow in the cracks they leave behind. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. We love to hear them. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more stories that linger long after the screen fades to black.